The Sanguinary Impetus was, maybe even by far, my favorite metal album of 2020. There's not much else that I've heard in recent memory that has the same balance of unrelenting heaviness and really quirky experimental conceptual technicality. This album is so packed full of treats that I dropped the needle pretty much at random to pick a riff to talk about and got something that I haven't talked about at all on this channel. So let's get into the weeds, or should I say the trees, a little bit to talk about what's bizarre and rhythmically unsettling about this riff from Arboreously Transfixed. A very cool thing the band did was release tabs and all sorts of versions of the tracks with various instruments cut out for the whole album. If you're a nerd like me, I highly recommend checking them out because after listening to the album a whole lot for a year, there was still a lot of moments that I was surprised to see in notation and that would have taken me 5 ever to transcribe. And as it turns out, different ways of notating the same thing is going to be kind of the main gist of this video. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. So the part that I'm talking about starts with a few 4/4 measures of palm muted eighth notes, which follows this static variable construction with eighth note triplets in the endings. Pretty straightforward. I'm including it because it gets us grounded for what comes after. Then we get a similar riff, but now in quarter note triplets. Also pretty straightforward. It feels a little like a slowed down version of that thing that just came before. This is also a static variable parts construction. And then things get weird. We're oriented from the last two little sections. We know what the quarter note feels like and what the eighth note sound like and what the quarter and eighth note triplets sound like. According to this, the next section is eighth note triplets, but in this pattern of eighth note, eighth note, eighth note, eighth note, dotted quarter of these triplets. In other words, we get a repeating rhythmic cell lasting for the length of 7 eighth note triplets. Here's that very slow with a metronome. If we were just getting this pattern in a vacuum, it would make a whole lot of sense to reorient ourselves to hear the eighth note triplet as the new beat and just call it 7/8 like this. The problem is that we get this rhythmic cell 6 times, then an ending that lasts for 5/16 notes at that original tempo. Then we get it again with a longer ending. Then we get some of it again with an even longer ending. Before I get into some more technical stuff about notation, let's just notice how weird this section is, which is very characteristic of the type of stuff that makes Defeated Sanity one of my all-time favorite death metal bands. The riffs sound kind of weirdly blurry and organic and off the grid, but instead of things sounding soft or mushy compared to the rigid jaggedness of most technical death metal, Defeated Sanity's music sounds alive and evil and brutal. At least that's how I feel about it. If you're not doing anything else, why not stick around while I talk about notation and finally get to that thumbnail image? Though, fair warning, things will get pretty deep into theory and notation. Basically, I don't think there's any great way to notate this passage in standard notation, or there are at least a few equally bad ways to do it. This is something that I think is really cool about so much metal. It fundamentally challenges the standard notational system in ways that show the seams and blind spots in what traditional music theory is good at talking about. The fundamental problem here is that there are two relevant durations in this riff. We have one that lasts for 7 eighth note triplets, which is reinforced by the repetition of that pattern. And another that lasts for 5 16th notes, which is highlighted because it's what the endings are built out of. These two durations are not at all in the same world as each other. There's no simple way to relate them to each other. So you have to relate them both to this invisible common beat, which is probably supplied in the studio by a click track. For the first duration, you divide that beat in 3 and then multiply that amount by 7. And then for the second duration, you divide the beat in 4 and then multiply it by 5. Conceptually, this makes sense, and even playing it isn't impossible if you learn it from a recording or MIDI rendering. Though it's actually really interesting what learning from these sorts of tools means, and my dissertation work will be partially about stuff like that. The problem comes when we try to represent these two distantly related durations in notation. I can think of at least 3 reasonable and equivalent ways of doing this that have different benefits. So they're equivalent in the sense that a MIDI playback will give you the same thing, though of course how you visually represent something has different meanings to musicians. As a side note, of course there are infinite ways of notating the same thing in standard notation in a way that a MIDI playback would be able to figure out and get the same result. But we try to pick notation based on what's kind of balance of what's readable, what's conceptually straightforward, and what is visually appealing. So the first option for notating this is what they published in their digital tab book, which is kind of how I've been explaining things so far. You have these long measures of 8/4 and 6/4, and within those you just write out the triplet rhythm within the bars. This is probably the conceptually simplest. The problem is that it doesn't really interpret these patterns for you, which maybe makes it a little hard to sight read, though I don't think any of these notations are something that someone could reasonably sight read. So the problem is kind of that it treats these triplets as like syncopations against a beat, but the beat isn't really there aurally during this passage. Another option would be to just straight up change tempo when you need to with some fancy tempo modulations. So going into this passage, we say that the 8th note triplet becomes the 8th note, then notate that part in 7/8, and then going out, we do the inverse. So the dotted quarter note becomes the quarter. This is kind of ugly, but it does reflect the easiest way to play this. Instead of hearing everything in relation to a single beat, which is very tricky, I started by just kind of latching onto these patterns as if they're all at different tempos and kind of learning it from there. And so this notation is cool because it says that, but it's having a bunch of tempo modulations one after another gets a little cluttered, and maybe it obscures the underlying connections between these things. Finally, there's the fancy version that uses irrational meters. These are nice in my opinion because they're elegant and they show the relevant groupings. The problem is that they're uncommon to see, even if conceptually these have a little edge over the others because this is kind of the exact situation they're designed for. They're probably the least practical because most notation softwares can't handle them. Even Dorico, which I use, won't automatically play them back correctly. And of course, most musicians haven't seen them and will probably end up unpacking them into one of the other 2 versions anyways. But this is a pretty rare instance where they at least offer a conceptual advantage over other options in metal. So let's bring them out, why not? And I think they express nicely the weirdness and the irrational sound of this rhythm. So here's this whole weird, heavy passage one more time for fun. one of the probably very small number of people for whom this made sense and was interesting, I'm so glad you found my channel. If you stuck around to the end just to watch the show, I also thank you very much. That's something I've started having fun doing on YouTube, watching really specialized things in subjects I don't know very much about, and that are very much over my head, and seeing what I can get from them, which can be very fun, and I definitely understand the appeal. So I hope I put on a good show. See ya.